Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for joining us for Larry McCulloch and Fuel Management. I just want to remind people about the Bulkley-Maurice Wildfire Resilience Project. So I'm Kevin. I'm the Planning and Policy Lead. So those of you who aren't aware, Larry is going to be basically one of the participants, one of the technical leads or professional leads inside the Bulkley-Maurice Wildfire Resilience Project. He's going to give you, I'll call it kind of a sneak peek really about a pretty deep topic that we're trying to dig into as part of the project. So I just want to ask people, if you're interested in learning and following the project, please look up the Bulkley-Maurice Wildfire Resilience Project on the BVRC's website. There is a newsletter you can sign up to there, and that's we're going to help people on, keep track of what we're doing. We have periodic newsletters, things like the seminars that we do will be advertised through that, and then we start over the next year to start to have other products start to come out. We're working on a chapter on fire effects, fire behavior, prescribed and cultural fire, and there's a whole bunch of other pieces. So this is a sneak preview. Hope you like it, and please do look up and sign up to our newsletter. And now over to Larry.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin, and thanks everybody for coming and taking an hour out of our best day of the year so far for weather. And thank you for the people that are joining remotely as well. As Kevin pointed out, I'm Larry. For those of you who don't, everybody here knows me. I feel like I'm preaching to the converted here, but I'm not sure who's joined in remotely. I'm a forester that has worked here in the Bulkley Valley for quite a long time. I think I arrived here in 1986. Been working on wildfire most of my career, but not solely. And I'm really excited to be involved in this project. I think it's exciting and important work that Kevin and Don and the crew are doing. And I feel like we've got a bunch of people here that all have something to contribute to it, and really, really happy to see you all. This is going to be a very high-level overview. It is not getting into the weeds about, the Red Book, for example, or getting into the weeds about Ron's new work on hazard abatement, or taking a look at any of the modeling or BCWS tools that we've got. So you'll have to, for those of you who are deeply in this subject, you'll have to tame your expectations, and maybe would be great for us, as Kevin said, this is kind of a sneak preview of these chapters that we're writing, and maybe this will serve to stimulate your interest and pique your interest to try to provide a bit of feedback on what we're doing here. So it's all in a state of transition right now, all these documents we're producing. So I'm going to try to get you guys warmed up. As Kevin pointed out, there's a chapter on fire behavior and fire effects. I'm not going to get into all those details around that, but there's some terminology I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with terminology. Stuff like, what is a surface fuel, ladder fuels? What do we mean by crown fire initiation, torching, spotting, candling, and smoke management issues? So this is just 60 seconds to warm you guys up with a bit of fire. Thinking about crown fire initiation and fire intensity, there is a calculator about that. We can think about, are there ladder fuels that allow the fire to reach into the canopy? Or are the surface fuels, are there enough surface fuels and environmental parameters like wind that will support crown fire initiation just from radiant heat or from direct contact with flame? So I'm looking at that image there and thinking that in the crown fire, that's like, say that's 9 meters. That fire intensity is going to be like 8,000 kilowatts per meter of fire front. That's one way of measuring intensity. And then so you're wondering why that tree to the right there is not igniting. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but you can see there's a pretty big crown base height there. There's a lot of gap between the surface fuels and the crown. These are just a few little comments so I think that tree did ignite eventually. We've got a lot of different stuff going on with weather there, and so you get these tornadoes. Here's a mega tornado, Pyro CB initiated tornado that I got from the Knowledge Network. By the way, there's a good link on that, I think somewhere in here, that you guys should take a look at. It's really cool. And then smoke management is a concern. That last shot there, I just want to go back to that for a second.
You throw a couple tires on there?
All right. So black smoke like that, is that intense fire or light fire? Pretty intense. We talk about deciduous trees being resistant to fire. Is that the case? Here's a cottonwood. Cottonwood's pretty resilient in terms of surviving fire interaction, but there was no direct flame on the base of that cottonwood, but it burst into flame anyway. Started smoldering, burst into flame. There's quite a bit of heat around it. Okay, so whether fuels are available or not depends on the fuel property themselves, like density, what kind of wood it is, moisture content, fire weather at the time, in particular air temperature, relative humidity, and wind. Those are big deals. Often when we're talking about fuel availability, we talk about the less than 7 centimeter diameter size class. Not so worried about the stuff that's larger in terms of rate of spread and fire initiation. It's important over the long haul, but in terms of fire spread and what we're trying to stop with suppression, it's that less than 7 centimeter diameter stuff that's really important. I mean, it's all important, but it's especially important. So we need to consider fire weather and other conditions to decide whether things are really available to burn or not. This is all kind of background to understanding the fuel treatment stuff. And some of you will have seen Phil's presentation on fire behavior. There's a fire effects chapter. And so some of the stuff's been covered, but I know some of the people that are attending remotely haven't seen it. So we talk about 90th percentile fire weather often when we're talking about fuels. And 90th percentile fire weather is weather conditions that are conducive to more aggressive fire behavior than that observed on 90% of the time in a given period. There's a fire weather 90th percentile fire weather calculator online. It's available through BCWS, and if you go there, it'll give you a choice of what time range you want to think about 90th percentile fire weather over. It's usually 10 years. I'm not sure if there's any choice besides 10 years. Is it right? I think it's just 10 years. Yeah, they used to have 5 down. Anyway, so if you go there, it'll give you fire weather indices that are down here. Let's show up. So down here we got these fire weather indices. We got an aqua fire weather station. I went there, I downloaded those, and then I plugged those things into this red book here. And if you open it up, and for people that aren't familiar with it, there's all these tables in here that show the relationship between initial rate of spread, initial spread index in this case, and BUI, and produces a number of important pieces of information that people need to know when they're doing prescriptions and need to know when they're thinking about fuel management. So, for example, if we have a C2 fuel type, which is boreal spruce, lots of that around here, not as much as C3, lots of logical pine, then, and you have fire weather that's at the 90th percentile, it has a big impact. That fuel type has a big impact on fire behavior. So if you look at the this information here, on a boreal spruce, you've got an independent crown fire, up to 90% of the crown fraction gets burned. That's a lot. Intensity class 4,000 to 10,000, big numbers, and 10 meters per minute for an equilibrium rate of spread. Compared to the pine, where we've got class 3 meters per minute. So anybody want to tell me why there's such a difference there, besides Brad and Shannon? Pardon me? More like type of fuel and fuel volume, a lot more volume in the spruce. So we got some interesting differences there. Anybody know what the target is for suppression when we're trying to talk about ground crews doing suppression action for fire intensity? So we talk about the fire intensity in terms of number of kilowatts per meter fire front, and usually we're trying to keep that under 2,000, but up to 4,000. Sometimes you're able to go on the ground, do some groundwork in terms of suppression. So if I'm thinking about trying to conduct a fuel treatment, I need to keep these things in mind. If I'm in a spruce type, I need to be pretty aggressive at fuel reduction through fuel management treatments. If I'm in a pine type, maybe not as much, because of the difference in terms of how fire behaves. Like I said, I wasn't going to really get into the fire behavior too much. We can go into a lot of detail about these things, but I just want to give you that as an example of trying to make sure you understand what your objectives are going to be. So fuel management then is the planned manipulation or reduction of forest fuels, so treatments like mechanical thinning and prescribed fire. I mentioned managed fire here as well, and I don't really talk about that in this presentation, but the concept behind managed fire is a wildfire that we somehow encourage through backburning or other actions, suppression actions, to steer that fire into different areas to achieve our wildfire management objectives. So managed fire, managed wildfire is a thing. It's complex and difficult. We're not getting into it in this presentation. So our objectives then, we talked about the 2,000, 4,000 kilowatts per meter of fire front, so we're reducing fire intensity. And we want to prevent crown fires and spotting. So crown fires sometimes move more quickly. They're pretty intense, as you saw in that little video clip. The flame length coming off that crown was really big, really big. You get a wind through there, and a lot of those trees torching like that, that's going to move quickly, and it has a potential to spot for long distances. Brad, what's the longest spotting distance you've seen? 5 kilometers.
In British Columbia, 20 in Australia.
Yeah, I was in Australia recently. I heard they had 20 to 30 kilometer spotting in some cases.
Yeah.
But that's not the case here. It's different fuel type. 5 kilometers is outrageous, but
Very, very, very seldom
very seldom.
in British.
So that makes firefighting difficult. It makes fuel management objectives tricky. Typically it's only a few hundred meters maybe, or even less. We also, in fuel management, a big thing that people forget, it's not just about controlling the fire to some extent and saving infrastructure. We're also trying to assist firefighters and suppression forces in their efforts. That includes both ground attack and air attack people. So we're buying time by changing fuels, reducing the rate of spread. We're creating access for the firefighters and egress for firefighters and for residents in the area, say, for example. We're trying to create anchor points and safe zones and reduce smoke so that, a helicopter can get them, do some bucketing, or you've got maybe a air tanker that's going to do a drop. I did want to point this out quickly. I'm not going to talk about fire behavior much. A lot of what we talk about is intensity versus severity. Severity is kind of like the ecological impact or the impact on infrastructure. Severity is a measure of impact, and intensity is a measure of the energy in the fire, like the heat potential in the fire. So when we're talking about intensity, it's an objective measure and allows us to compare different treatments to see whether we're achieving our objectives or not. So it's like H, which is a constant that's to do with the fuel itself. How dense is it, basically? How dense is that wood? And then the weight of the fuel and the rate of spread. It's a pretty simple equation, but we often, when we're talking about fuel management, talk about how much fuel do we have out there and what do we need to mitigate it. But you can't forget the fire weather thing, which I already brought up, and that rate of spread piece. That all contributes to intensity. If you don't have the oxygen feeding that fire, then it's going to act differently. Okay, let's get on to actual fuel treatments. So starting with mechanical treatments, basically it's thinning. There's some other kinds of treatments, but usually what we're talking about is thinning. Some people call it shaded fuel break, depending on the extent of it, and that can be done in conjunction with all kinds of other things, such as pruning branches, so you're increasing the crown or increasing the fuel strata gap and removing some of the ladder fuel. And then you're going to have a lot of accumulation on the ground. So if you're doing a thinning treatment, you're not decreasing surface fuels, you're increasing surface fuels, you're decreasing crown fuels. So we want to decrease crown fuels a lot And then we want to deal with the surface fuels. Maybe we can just leave them, but I haven't seen any literature that talks about less fuel, less surface fuel after thinning. This is a place that I did this one on the left is a place that I went and looked at down near Lytton, not long after that fire down there. Actually, I think it was just before that, the year before that. And I was looking at their fuel treatments down there, trying to decide what worked and what didn't, and where they interacted with wildfire. So you can see that on the treated area, it's quite a bit more open than the untreated area. And then on the right, this is an example near Kelowna, actually between Kelowna and Vernon. Actually, I was down there with Brad at one point, and also Rory Colwell. So those guys treated that area, and the fire approached that but didn't interact with it. So, or it was basically stopped by the treatment. So that was good. Here, it's lucky it didn't get in here because they still left these piles in there that they hadn't burned. So those would have created a lot of ember cast. I'll say some quick principles. By the way, these chapters are written as a kind of a literature review. They're not really written in a way that is easily digestible. It's not like science you can use kind of bulletins or things like that. We're trying to demonstrate in a pretty academic way what we know about it. And Kevin may want to add more on this, but I think the plan is that we're going to try to take these kinds of documents and produce something that's more useful for people. But we need to make sure that we're doing our homework and due diligence on getting input from people about what's appropriate and what's not. You'll see I make some recommendations here, not really recommendations, I just throw out some ideas and I say, this is something you guys might want to think about around here. And I'm sure there'll be some feedback on that. Hopefully not too much today. So some of the principles are, first of all, factors that influence include things like the amount and size and spatial distribution of fuel. Stand structure is really important, as we'll see. How much time has elapsed since you actually did the treatment? Obviously, weather, we talk about that a lot. Topography, suppression, response, something people forget about. Suppression and treatments in combination are effective. That's where we're going with a lot of our work. So do we retreat the area, like treat it again? So we do a treatment, then stuff grows in, changes, we need to do something more about it. Well, that depends on how you shift your mosaic around in the landscape. And maybe 5 to 15 years might be the number. Do we have money for 5 to 15 years? I don't know. Some people talk about leaving large trees, because large trees are more likely to resist fire, but up here, Les or Jeff are going to tell us maybe that these trees that we have, spruce and pine and balsam, aren't really that resistant to fire. They get killed pretty easily. So we can leave them, and the larger ones are better. But what's the downside of leaving large fissured bark? Ryan, any ideas? Pardon me?
Fuel, ladder.
Yep, it's going to climb up the tree. So large trees are good and bad, different ways. Or another way to ask that is, if you look at the US literature, it says, yeah, you got to leave large trees. Large trees are the way. That's the answer. You go, well, what is it answering? And it is answering having some trees out there afterwards, but it isn't changing fire behavior. Okay, we want to avoid leaving bridges or wicks. And you'll see some photos here that are randomly, I didn't choose any on purpose, but sometimes if we have a fuel treatment and then we leave an area, say a riparian area, it's possible that the fire will follow up that bridge or that wick, but it's also possible it won't because they're often really wet. So thinning has to be combined with surface fuel removal or discontinuity, as I already said. And removal is one thing, but even just creating gaps between the fuel is important. Crown fuel reduction. You saw in that one image, and there's probably going to be others here, that we need to really change crown fuel if we want to make a difference in terms of wildfire impact. You've got a flame length that's 5 meters or 6 meters, 8 meters in that one I showed you, and it's horizontal like this. That's a long distance between tree crowns that has to be changed so that we don't get that continuous crown fire. So how much does that change? Sorry. One of the authors that's pretty prolific in the wildfire world interviewed 43 wildfire experts across Canada and said, how much of your fuel breaks are effective? And they on average said 33% of fuel breaks were not breached by wildfire. So that's why we come back to this idea about suppression and fuel treatments together. And a major point that I probably should stress every slide is we don't have good evidence here of wildfire interacting with fuel treatments. We haven't done very many fuel treatments. We've done some prescribed fire, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but thinning treatments and mechanical treatments, we hardly have any that have interacted with wildfire. I looked at a few. They were too small, not in the right places, so they weren't very effective. However, there's tons of evidence they can be effective under certain circumstances elsewhere, and I think it's true here as well. It's just that we don't really know for sure. So we're taking a gamble when we do these things. Are they going to be useful or not? Probably. Climate-driven fuel environment versus fuel-driven fuel environment. This is something that'll come up in all of our work in this wildfire resiliency project. Up here, we got a lot of fuel. We got a lot of duff, and we got a lot of surface fuels, and we don't get a lot of really extreme fire weather. So up here, it's not a lack of fuel that's driving big wildfires, it's the climate. I mean, it's a combination of the things, but climate is more likely to be an important driver here, the first most important driver perhaps. And then elsewhere, down in the IDFTK3, for those of you that are familiar with the biogeclimatic system, or down in the southern interior, there's not as much fuel, it's wider spacing, some fuel, some stand types, there's less, smaller trees. And so there, they have often more extreme weather, and then the fuel itself becomes the more limiting factor. That's what I mean by climate-driven versus fuel-driven. And the point here is that, if you get 95th percentile fire weather, not much is going to stop that. That's a problem for us. So do we design our treatments for 95th percentile, 90th percentile? What do you design our treatments for? And can we even predict, what the frequency of those things is going to be? Sorry, I keep trying to tap on the screen here. Thinning limitations, 7 centimeter fuels. Speaking about 7 centimeter fuels, the BCWS Fuel Management Guide recommends trying to get your target fuel loads down to 7 tons per hectare. I've got some photos of what that looks like later. 7 tons per hectare is tough to achieve that. So that's a starting point for thinking about it. I don't know whether we're going to be getting it everywhere we go. And there's lots of controversy about thinning leading to more open, windier, drier conditions, or higher levels of vegetation over time. Those things are probably true. How important they are here in our climate-driven environment, I don't know. Well, there's some influence there for sure, but are they critical? I don't know.
Just something very quickly to clarify there. I think when you're talking about 5 tons per hectare for surface fuel loading, that's woody fuels only.
Yeah, also these thinning treatments are super expensive unless you can also salvage timber. So if you go in there, take some trees out, make $1 at that by selling them to the mill. That's really good. That might be our only solution, actually, because otherwise it's like, I've heard of $20,000 per hectare. 4,000, 10,000 is common in the literature for a fuel treatment. So you don't do very many hectares before you're broke. The advantages, though, are that it's you have more control and less risk than fire. If we're using prescribed fire, that's difficult work. We don't have a skilled workforce necessarily. BCWS can't do all of our burns for us. So that's a really important point. We've got a lot of control there. There's way less risk. Just hitting the big points. Okay, so what we did in this chapter that I did on standable fuel treatments, I have 5 of these kinds of treatments that we do. And and organize them by saying, here's the conditions in which you use this kind of treatment. And then if you are using it, and there are limitations, that's for sure, then what, where are they advantageous and where are they not? So we talked about reducing rate of spread, preventing continuous crown fire. These are primary objectives. Reduce fire intensity, reduce spotting, fuel drying, support suppression. Already talked about those things. Those are what we're trying to do with our fuel treatments. And then what is the mechanism of this treatment? How does that act? How effective is it? Do we have some uncertainty about it? And what are our targets? So most of this stuff, everything up here may not be that controversial, but these targets will be controversial. And I don't say these are what we should be doing. I say they're a starting point for experimentation rather than recommendations. And the green means that it's favorable. Yellow, it's reasonable. Orange and red are kind of unfavorable. So is this thinning good? We want moisture fuels. We don't want dry fuels. So if we open up the stand, then when it comes to fuel drying, we're going to get dry conditions, which we don't necessarily want. But otherwise, it looks like pretty good, a pretty good way of doing it. It's, as I said, expensive and a few other things. So we're trying to get rid of the lighter fuels. We want some big crown spacing, big distance between the crowns. It varies in the literature actually from 2 meters, say in a pine stand, to 10-meter crown spacing, but I think it's somewhere closer to 8 meters. Trying to get 5 tons per hectare is going to be pretty hard, but if you can get down to at least 10, you've got a good chance of getting reduced fire intensity that'll be less likely to do crown fire initiation. Piles per hectare. Yeah, most of the literature is looking at 2, but less than 3 anyway. We don't know. And support suppression, yes. Support suppression because you create all those things I talked about. You create access, you slow down the fire, people can get in there, it's not as hot. I won't spend as much time on that slide and the other ones because it's these are dense information in one slide. Okay, thinking about thinning, you're gonna have to expect some fire. Fire is gonna breach all your thinning treatments practically. There's gonna be fire entering into the periphery or maybe across them or whatever. That's okay. It's okay to have some fire. Some fire is beneficial for sure, but we need to support our other objectives as well, not just preventing fire. We want to prevent structure loss, but preventing fire altogether isn't really what we're trying to do. And so you need to set your objectives carefully when you're doing that, making sure it's used in the right circumstances. Beneficial fire, yeah, that's a thing. I'm not going to go into it now, though. Okay, so going on to prescribed fire. Prescribed fire is where we are actually controlling it, usually through broadcast burning, but burning the repulse also counts. It's intentionally applied under controlled conditions, controls to some extent. We choose our fire weather indices before we burn. We get a burn plan, we get approval, and we're trying to reduce fine fuels, but not DUF necessarily. Or are we? Do you want to talk about that now? I think I have your.
Then there's escapes, right?
There's escapes, yes.
Lots of them.
Lots, yeah, you had some in the past for sure. Okay, so lots of factors affecting prescribed fire, but what we're trying to do in general terms, in terms of principles, is it's interesting. Is that the colors in these boxes showing up on there? So we're trying to avoid simulating irregular cut block boundaries. We're trying to if we're thinking we're going to have wildfire, it's a high risk area, or we are actually planning a burn, then we're going to construct possibly fire guards in some perimeters. We're going to ensure there's reliable water source. We're going to plan for smoke. We're going to use topography. You've got a big open cut block, and you've got a lot of slash in the middle, and you light that up. It creates a convection column, draws all the fire in. That's good. Or if you're on a big slope like this, you can strip it from the top, burning down. Then it controls the rate of spread up, burning into itself. Anchor cut blocks, resistant features. Well, avoid large piles on the perimeter, which we often have. We often have a road right there in the perimeter, then we build these huge piles. If they don't get abated, then could be trouble. Yeah, there's lots of uncertainty. I didn't say this before, but I probably should have. It's that the reason we could have more certainty around prescribed fire being effective, except most of it occurred in the mid 1990s, and then it really tapered off. And then we weren't quite as careful about documenting how much fuel there was in site beforehand, how much was left, how effective the broadcast burn was. Like sometimes we light up a burn, it's kind of patchy, didn't get the right fire weather. So weather conditions are critical. Achieving specific fuel reduction targets, not easy. Fire is not a scalpel. Prescribed fire is a blunt instrument. This is not a scalpel. Don't expect too much. A lot of regulatory requirements, authorizations, notifications. There's a kind of a specialized workforce that's required for ignition and control, not readily available. Not saying don't do it, I'm just saying it's not easy. Maybe less costly if conducted at scale. I don't know about that, I haven't seen it so far, but maybe down the road, skilled workforce we need. I'm skipping this. It's just saying here's some evidence about how much fuel loading there was after in the past. And some potential targets. Yeah, we're just going for less than 2,000 kilowatts most of the time, less than 10 tons per hectare. As you saw in that first slide about spruce versus pine, just depends on the fuel type you're dealing with, excuse me. And it's a pretty effective treatment, except it's difficult. Okay, most people don't think about silviculture treatments as a fire mitigation measure, but they are actually one of our best. And that could be stuff like mounting discretion or scarification with mechanical treatments, or it could be in the way you establish your stand, which species you choose, planting density, pattern, vertical structure you're trying to create. Those things are all important. There's some ancillary things like brushing, spacing, and pruning. People aren't doing much of that anymore, and it's generally speaking detrimental, except for the pruning to fire behavior. So this is what that chart looks like. In this case, it was for, oh no, this is not the chart, sorry. This is just saying, this is so common in literature. It says, yeah, save these guys so they don't burn very easily, or they don't die very easily. And these guys die easily. But as we were talking about, it can crawl, this fire can crawl up the stem, right? So this isn't truly changing fire behavior, it's changing how many trees we have in the stem. Broadleaf species, lots of talk about that. Everybody thinks we should do plant aspen or encourage aspen at least. And in general, it's true that aspen has, less moisture. Sorry, it's got higher moisture content in the leaves. It's got less volatile oils. It's lower canopy bulk density. No, I haven't seen any literature that says aspen in particular supports crown fire. But I have seen crown fire for short distances, but it's not really the best. And these guys should have said who surveyed 84 people, 137 practitioners, and said that aspen reduces occurrence and severity, but the effect is highly variable. And they got a whole pile of stuff in there about why that is the case. But I would say up here in our area, it's not a good choice. I'm very doubtful about it. Half the aspen around here are dead or have dead tops. We've got the sinuating leaf miner, the cankers, the drought. They're not looking great. And as a result, we've got a lot of understory brush and not as moist a condition as we would normally. And also aspen has got a broad ecological amplitude. Aspen grows from Mexico to Alaska on every kind of site you can imagine. And so on some sites, it's like shitty little trees that aren't going anywhere. On other sites, it's big, old growth aspen with nice canopy and probably a lot of shrubs underneath because it's moist in there. But, it's broad, it's really variable. Aspen, just be careful with that if you're trying to use it as a mitigation strategy.
I think something that might help, when you think of aspen and any of these, when we talk about trees, don't look at the tree and forget the forest. We're talking about stand structure, overall stand structure. And a lot of these species are associated with a certain stand structure, and that's how the fire behavior has been determined from them. So if the stand structure used to determine the fire behavior is different, although the leading tree species may be the same, then you have to look at it with a different lens and determine is that better or worse than the scenario in these red books and how fire behavior is modeled with these different species.
Yeah, some good points there. Absolutely. Every situation is a bit unique. You need to think it through carefully.
Yeah.
Stand density, it's my favorite. Silviculture treatment. And it's so easy. All the licensees already do it. So if you're trying to create a well-stocked stand of spruce pine balsam, when it hits 20 to 40 years of age, it is very fire resistant. I don't know if you can see it very well on here, but this was 2018 out in the Nina fire. All this stuff around here was moderate and high severity fire. And then all these green blobs, Phil, I think, showed something like this as well. All those green blobs didn't get burned. Sometimes I looked at a lot of these things carefully. I was out there on the site in some cases I just looked at Google Earth imagery. And sometimes there's a little fringe burn. Other times, really no burn whatsoever. And then people say, well, those are all going to die anyway, because sometimes, even though they look green from the imagery, the fire crawled around through the stand, and I don't like that word, skunked. And so the roots were burned the next thing. But here it is. What is that? 6 years later, still alive. Almost all of them. Probably all of them. Maybe some trees have died. I don't know. Very, very effective. I was out with Brad in the shovel fire. We're looking at a site. I'm just going to try to quote you here, Brad, but tell me if I got the numbers wrong. But I think we talked about this rank 6 fire. Very high intensity fire comes through, hits the stand, and stops. So I thought, okay, Brad's saying this is rank 6. This has got to be at least that. Could be rank 10. Well, there's no such thing, but anyway. So it's a great strategy because it moves around through time. It's something that's conventional practice already. If we carefully design what we do and make sure they're well stocked, doesn't have to be overly stocked, 1,800 stems per hectare, it's going to be effective. Now, Phil has done a bit of science around this as opposed to just observations that I have. Actually, I did some science on it as well in a study for the province. And it doesn't always work, but my question is exactly what was it about that stand structure or location that made it not work? I think it's going to work if we virtually every time if we put it in the right location and the right stand structure. There's also the flip side of this, which is there's fire management stocking standards that government has developed. They say we're going to they don't have any examples. They've only got some examples for the BWBS and IFTK3 and one other zone. They don't have any examples for around here for the SBS. So they say that basically what they're saying is the current standard for target in this particular bioclimatic unit is 400. We want to take that down to 175. So they might go from 1,000 down to 600 or 1,200 to 600 or something around here. We don't know. They haven't provided that information, but the idea there is that we're going to reduce ground fire and fast moving high intensity ground fire by getting to canopy bulk density like that. But this has not been tested in the bulk race. You need to make sure you don't get a lot of ingress. I did a study quite a few years ago, looking at all the free growing stands that Canfor had in the last 10 years, every one of them across all these, the whole BUMO. The average stocking was 4,000 and something stems per hectare, total stems per hectare. So there was a lot of ingress there. So if you're only planting 700, but you get 3,000 ingress, is that helping? I don't know. Yeah, maybe. Open stand potential, same as with thinning in terms of risks, in terms of understory development and drying and those things.
Basically double. We did 1,600 and basically we got 3,000 average in bulk.
Yeah, for example, yeah. I'm skipping this slide. I'm just going to say there's other kinds of treatments, but we're not doing them anymore. Like West Fraser doesn't do any differentiation anymore. Neither does Canfor. BC TS didn't do any. the last few years. I talked to all these guys to see, I did some interviews with them. I tried to get a hold of them, I'm gonna get a hold of them, but I don't think anybody's doing disc trenching. That's a good strategy in terms of changing the orientation and creating gaps in between pieces of fuel, but nobody's doing it. Mounting, you know, it's a spot here and a spot there and a spot there. It's not quite as effective. And although talking to Colin Vandergag, he said that the wildfire did interact with was basically a skate with the mounted area, and that mounting did change behavior. But there's some potential there, but it isn't as important. So Phil Burton and Alana Klassen, they did a study looking at the 6 wildfires that occurred, I think it was just in 2018 around here, and they said they concluded that silvicultural treatments like MSP and things were the least important factor in terms of fire behavior there. They said there was some correlation, but it was the least important out of all the other kinds of factors that you can consider. Landscape level, stand level treatments are landscape level treatments. It's about the scope. So you're doing it in broader areas, blocks, strips. It's about the amount, type, and continuity of fuel. Those 20 to 40-year-old stands could be a fuel break, part of a fuel break. But obviously, rocky ridges and large lakes and things are important. So what are our objectives with landscape level fuel treatments? This is the critical difference between stand level and landscape level. We're trying to do dose meaning the amount of treatment and the kind of treatment that has effect beyond the treatment footprint. So stand level, we're just trying to create a difference in this footprint right here. With landscape level, we're trying to make fire behavior change across a much broader area. So we're trying to, Kevin likes to say, cool the landscape, reduce wildfire extent, create control lines that are accessible and defensible. Plenty of evidence that fuel breaks make a difference. However, fuel breaks that don't have suppression action with them, in one study, turned out less than 1% of fires were stopped by the fuel break alone. That was actually a broad study. Hundreds of examples they looked at. It was all in the US. Treating smaller isolated stands out, considering the broader landscape, will be unlikely to reduce wildfire extent or severity. Fuel breaks will often fail in extreme weather. Simulation studies suggest that this is very controversial for here. We don't really have the faintest idea. Don is directly targeting this concept, though. 30% of the landscape. If you treat 30% of the landscape either with fuel breaks or in the intervening matrix, which I like to call a discontinuity matrix, in that discontinuity matrix and the fuel breaks, if you go beyond 30%, doesn't really make any difference in fire behavior. So that suggests that 30% is going to be a threshold that you've achieved everything you can achieve. It's probably less than that. We don't know. Yeah. I only put this in here because I love my job sometimes. I flew into this place up in NWT doing an investigation on fire up there. It's freaky beautiful. So you can just see in there, that's where the fire starts. Looks like this. When we're thinking about fuel break design, we want to create heterogeneity in the landscape. It's not just fuel break, but the entire landscape. Heterogeneity. And this is a naturally occurring heterogeneous landscape here. You can see a lot of variety in there. It's partly because of all the wet lands and things in there. But we can do other things to make that happen. We want to design for a certain fire weather. Are we designing for 90th percentile or 95th percentile? What are we doing out there? How much money do we have? Is kind of what that question is. What do we know about efficacy and how much money do we have? So maybe we can only design for 85th percentile. We don't have enough money to do 95th percentile. I don't know. Extent, how big? Extent is how much, and how big is size. Where we place them, do we place them next to ridges, rivers, or do we use those as natural barriers and then place them in the areas that aren't already naturally resistant? Prior wildfire makes a difference. Got a little section on that in one of the reports, one of the chapters. How much difference is less certain? You want to talk about that for 2 seconds, Brad?
Say that again?
The prior wildfire idea.
Oh, well, I mean, it depends on that wildfire, how hot it burned and how much it cleaned up those fine fuels. But what's super important in all that also is what fuel type is coming back. Is it coming back to something that's more susceptible to burn, such as grass, as opposed to an understory of aspen? You also want to know if that original fire, if it was a crown fire, not if it was more of a ground fire, then your standing trees fall over after the fire, and you have the grass or fireweed coming up, as we've seen in many locations. Then you can have another fire again in 6, 7, 10 years, as opposed to that more, when we talk about 100 and something year return interval for a given area. So
What's the most times in one spot you've seen a wildfire
for
occur?
6 years it came back. Now it's just dirt. That's in
6 years. How many times was there wildfire on that spot? 5 times wildfire in the same spot over a period of
different
Not very
wildfires,
long.
different parts of it. Some of it is just mineral soil, scorched mineral soil.
right, and I've seen quite a bit of that now. Lots of places where there's no duff, hardly any mineral, so a lot of it was washed away. It's like a boulder field. I don't know. I'm not trying to be a drama queen here, but things are changing, and prior wildfire isn't necessarily a solution. It could be. Now, we talked about treatment and suppression being a good combination, how much we retreat. Another thing that we didn't talk about yet, but when it comes to landscape level fuel management, it's multi-stakeholder. We need a lot of people involved. And the role of industry is critical. It's complex out there. I have a slide, I didn't put it in here, but showing the complexity. It's very complex. It's hard to model. It's hard to figure out. We need to be ready to be adaptive and change course, pivot when we need to. One thing that's clear though, we need to start at the WUI. At the wildland urban interface, that's where we need to start things. That's where we want to spend the majority of our money, probably. How do we implement landscape level strategies? I'm just going to skip through this quickly. There's, you can do this kind of thing that I did in the Banjam zone, where we break the landscape into zones, and for each zone there's a bunch of rules about it, and they've got like 300-meter wide fuel breaks that are chosen based on all kinds of factors. And I think Don's got a challenge if he's going to be trying to identify those. I think myself, anyway, a guy like Brad in the room, who's been around that area for a while, he would be able to say where those things need to go. So it's a combination of maybe artificial intelligence, Brad intelligence, and modeling. That's one approach. Another approach is very similar. We've got a lot of talk about this in our project, where we're trying to develop these pods, they're called, and PCLs, pods, potential operational designations, where it's the same sort of thing, where you design an area that's a zone that has certain operational restrictions, and then you've got control lines, like this is down in Toronto National Forest, which I presume is Arizona. But strategies, I don't know. There's a lot that could go in here, but how much do we need? How big are these things? What kind of width do we want on the fuel breaks? And inside, if we're treating them like a hectare here or 2 hectares there, is that doing us anything? How big does it need to be? Discontinuity index. I'll give you more on that some other time when I've got further on my thinking on that. I'm not getting into this. Sorry, Brian. It's like industry, current practices in industry are a lot around abatement. There's some new rules coming out about abatement. Or can you give me your 3-sentence version of this?
Verification.
Verification.
Verifying the framework and recommended starting point for practices.
Okay, so you guys will probably know, most of you here will know, that you've got these maps that show where risk is high, and then based on that risk level, you've got these kinds of charts that tell you for a certain species, aspect, and slope, how much fuel you're allowed to have. You compare this number here to that map, the number you get from your map, and if it exceeds that, then you need to treat. And what's really interesting about this is it gives you the amount you have to treat it to. So for dispersed slash and piles, it says down here in this gray box, all through these, only 1 to 5 tons per hectare are allowed. Up here, 6 to 19. Now these are things that aren't, they're guidance. They're not required. But if you're not going to follow those, they need to be designated professional that can, or what's the term? We have to be an RFT or a professional forester to prescribe something different. And just to show you how hard that is, this stuff here is 1.6 tons in less than 7 centimeters, and no fuel in the greater than 7 centimeters. Very, very clean. Looks like a park in there. Down here is cut block, something like what we have around here. It's 12.7 tons less than 7. So that's what 12.7 tons looks like. This is what 10 tons looks like, and this is what this is a broadcast burn. I'm not sure you can see it on the screen there. In the computer, it's pretty easy, but anyway, they broadcast burn this, and there's only 1.4 tons less than 7 centimeters. So that's cool. It's a good outcome. But there's 30 tons of other wood, which should be good for biodiversity in some ways. Utilization. There's a practice that's going on right now, which is process at the stump. When you process the stump, you're leaving a ton of material out there. This is not good for wildfire. And in areas where we think we need to be more careful about wildfire, then we should be thinking about doing that differently. I already talked about silviculture, but here's a chart showing a lot of wildfire back here in 1986. Okay, up till mid-1990s, then nothing. That's prescribed fire.
Although it's smoke.
Oh, this is broadcast burning, right? So power burning.
That's where it went down. It's for the smoke.
Yeah, you mean people didn't like the smoke. I hear you. And knowledge gaps. There's a lot of knowledge gaps. Yeah. One thing that I would point out here, though, is we need to not just know more about these treatment effects in our neck of the woods, our ecosystem, but also about environmental function. How are they impacting environmental function? What are some protocols we can start using to get real-time data on wildfire impacts? I think that's a pretty critical one as well. Yeah, just in a nutshell, at this landscape level, there's a lot of stuff. We need to do more simulation modeling. We need a much better data input in things like VRI and in our fuel types themselves, which are pretty crappy. In this study, 66% of the fuel types were incorrectly classified. That was a Van Jam. And here's the thing that's most important out of this entire slide, though. How do we operationalize fuel break design and landscape level treatments? What's the role of indigenous land stewards, industry, private landowners, and the public? How do we operationalize that? That's where we need to be going with this stuff. And maybe FLPs and FOPs are the way to do it. We're putting a lot of weight on that, though. If that doesn't work out for us, it's trouble. This is important. Okay, so closing comments. Do I have more? No. Predictions of increasing frequency and size of wildfires in our area, and demands proactive fuel management strategies to mitigate wildfire risk and impact. So it's got to be proactive. It's got to use adaptive management. And we're just hoping this work that we're doing is going to stimulate some new thinking and serve as a reference for the current state of knowledge respecting fuel management. It builds on a lot of stuff. There's like that fuel management guide that BCWS produced is much more involved than what we produced here. We're trying to focus in on some specific things. How do we act? How do we implement stuff? And we hope that this kind of stuff sparks some intrigue and a bit of dialogue and provides a foundation for you guys to start experimenting with stuff. Thank you. Any questions?
Those 20 to 40-year-old stands, does it matter what species they're planted to?
Well, I looked all across the province, and the only place I found that it didn't work, and maybe this because my sample size wasn't big enough, was Douglas fir on the coast. So and I'm not very sure about out in the Chilcotin because I didn't go out there, but I looked down in the southern interior, up here, down in the Kootenays, and it was pretty consistent, was effective everywhere with, pine, spruce, and balsam. I didn't have any pure larch stands that I went into, so I don't know about that. But yeah, for the most of the species, it's every species.
Follow up with that.
Because there was a question online, so about had those green blocks been broadcast burned, the 20 to 40-year-old stands? And then Alana hopped on and said some had, some hadn't, but the best predictor of fire severity was stand age. And then there was a share from that questioner saying we've also observed mounded sites causing holdovers in the organic pockets within the mounds.
Yeah, good point.
And that was in Tanglejing, so
Right,
bits
nice.
and pieces all over the place.
Yeah, good point by Alana.
Yeah.
Has there been any testing of what happens over time with that kind of distribution? So those 20 to 40s become 40 to 80s and
Oh, yeah.
60s, and then you have more dead people or whatever. So that effect.
It's a really good question, and nobody's, I don't think Phil's work studied that many stands that were older than 40, but there were some, and Phil and Alana, that is, and others. My own sense, though, is just looking at the imagery that it can't be much older than 40, otherwise we'd see some of those had survived. However, to put a proviso on that, maybe it's partly because we just didn't do the logging, as much logging back then, so we don't really know.
If you look at the TSR for Lakes and Maurice, there's an age class gap of what would be age class 3. There was almost none because we didn't start logging until 1980 essentially. So there's just a big age class gap. I don't think fire encountered very many of those 40 to 60 stands.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah, nice question. Because if it was longer than that, that's great, because then we have an extended period of fire resiliency. We should be able to find
50-year-old
plantation, right? But maybe there are some natural stands that met the criteria. So
should be some over 50.
Very few.
Very easy to plant those fires.
yeah,
That's only 75.
and Prince George, they've got older over there. We should take a look at that.
Hey, do you do any work on other ways to get rid of fuel? Like,
Oh, yeah.
pile and burn now.
Mastication, you mean, or
Yeah.
for example? Yeah, there's a few other ways. We have some charts. I just didn't pick those because I didn't have time. But yeah, mastication is something, but it's got its limitations.
Like chipping or.
Chipping, mastication, that there's a whole guide on that guidebook on it that BCW was produced last year. And there's another one that's kind of cool. It's called cold fire. Cold fire is where you introduce fungi into the small slash, and it accelerates the decomposition.
What about larger fuels? Because larger fuels, if they're not elevated and laying on the ground, it shouldn't be a fire hazard.
I don't know. Do you want to talk about that, Brett?
Well, yeah, I mean, for sure, because they're in contact with the ground, which may have some moisture in them, they don't contribute to that initial spread. Their importance is if you have high drought codes, is they're just going to smolder and burn longer, but they're not really a big issue on the ground, large logs.
Yeah, because what we're trying to do is prevent fire from moving through fast. And those things aren't really contributing to that too much. If they're all stacked up and piled and they cast embers, yes, but
one of the issues with, like, for example, the pine beetle, when those large logs that fall down that are sort of either on the ground or elevated, is when the bark starts to slough. That then becomes a fine fuel that contributes at significant, as does any of the medium and finer twigs that might be on some of those stands that come down.
and those big pieces of bark, if that they ignite and they stay as an ember, and that huge plume of fire generated smoke and hot air, they carry for a long way.
And because of the additional fuel that you have in your fire is more intense, so it does loft those embers higher. So it's able to carry larger embers higher and transfer them further, and they maintain their combustion. So when they land, they can cause more spotting, as opposed to a finer fuel that typically burns out before it gets a long distance, before it falls out.
Yeah.
The ground.
Yeah, so I think it's good in terms of having some large forest woody debris out there. It's not, you don't want to be critical about that.
So Larry, and again, there's a lot of messiness here, there's a lot of uncertainty. How much has that changed in the last 5 years? And you've been looking into who's doing the homework, who's doing the research. How much do you predict we're gonna start to narrow down that uncertainty in the next 5 years? Like, where are we at in sort of improving our knowledge to actually be able to address some of this messiness?
That's such a loaded question. What's Kevin want me to say? But it's true, we're moving that way, and there's been so much work done elsewhere that has some clues, but we're not sure enough. So we need to spend a lot more time working on it here. This project that we're involved in is really good that way. It's really stimulating some thought about it, attracting some attention, hopefully some funding, so we can get out there and start doing some more modeling, but also some actual experimentation with fire on the ground with various treatments. Or failing that, you know, if there's a wildfire out there, then Brad's a incident commander. She probably won't be these days, but he could have been. Then he will say, I know there's a field treatment over here, and we are going to go and put some instrumentation out there, and or make some measurements that we didn't already have, and get some damn data so that when that fire hits that thing, we can work with it. Or in the US, they're putting out instrumentation all over the place in wildfires and collecting real data. So that's super important, because all the stuff we're doing is based on the Red Book work that the Canadian Forest Service did, and those guys didn't really care about the West that much, in my opinion. They did so much work back east, where it was easy for them to, not that they're based out of Ottawa, they're easy for them to do the experimentation there. So our stuff here is like thin. We need to do it. But yes, we're making progress, is Kevin's main point, I believe.
Yeah, I think it's important, and Shannon, right, you can correct me, is Wildfire has in the last few years definitely stepped up the game to be at those sites and understand that a fire may have an encounter with a field treatment and go out there and be able to collect the information. It's kind of a, I don't know, quick hit team or whatever, and I think that's also part of pride with FP Innovations. But there is a system that they're looking to put it in place to collect that valuable information.
Yeah, and I looked at that stuff in 2019. That FP Innovations idea, I thought it was good, looked a bit cumbersome. Nobody I've talked to has used it since. I don't know, Shannon, is that still the case, or?
Yeah, well, and we're setting that up to do it locally at the fire center.
Nice.
Between myself and Pete, we're gonna be monitoring treatments like the in-stand versus control. And when we do have field treatment interactions with wildfire, we're gonna be prepared. I mean, we have a provincial process linking in our headquarters, but we're trying to set ourselves up so we can do that quickly and do it there quicker.
So questions regarding climate. So fires in Google are likely to be climate driven, but the focus is on fuel treatments. So are there or can there be climate target treatments to reduce things like stand temperature, relative humidity, wind?
I think that one of my messages I'm trying to get across is that we need to understand that our fuel treatments have varying impacts on fire behavior and effect depending on weather. And so that needs to be recognized in every single thing we do. But the specifically tests how much difference there is between 95th percentile versus 90th percentile. That's a big job. I don't know if anybody can do that, but that point, whoever made that comment, is a good one, that we need to understand the fire weather part of it, how effective our treatments are in the context of fire weather.
The site preparation piece is interesting. Was curious if there are ongoing studies on that, or what the interest in them would be in ongoing studies. So.
None that I know of. Licensees are not incentivized to do this. I invited some licensees, nobody showed up, but licensees, they've got a job to do that's mandated by their accountants and shareholders, and they're not doing stuff unless they're given guidance on it. So you can't fault, or some people can fault them for that one. But we need to change that system so that we can get them more fully engaged. And I don't know how to do that exactly, although I have some ideas.
A bit back to the 20 to 40-year-old blocks and broadcast burning. So many blocks that are under 20 years old in the DEMA fires have burned. And so proposing if we had maintained broadcast burning beyond the 80s, would we have lost less for generating stands that are less than 20 years?
I think so, but I don't know for sure. So that's a good point, is that it's not just one thing that we're doing out there. We have to have a combination of things. So we have to have, I've got a model for this in one of the reports that shows how you have a sequence of different kinds of treatments that are very wide, maybe a kilometer wide, that compensate for the idea that 0 to 20-year-old stands are not very fire resistant unless you've done some fuel mitigation work beforehand.
I think you also have to consider, when you look back 25 years, prior to that, we were logging green forest. And now we're logging for a big part in the Maurice and lakes, in some areas here, bug-killed forest, which naturally are going to leave more slash on the ground if it's not treated.
Also, winter logging versus summer logging, things like that.
Time to
Sure.
ground closure.
Time to ground closure, that's been density dependent.
Yeah, I understand the interest in trying to understand fire and, kind of the science of fire. And you've got some treatments that might slow fires down. Are these primarily for protecting communities, houses, infrastructure? Or is this for somehow protecting the forest?
Brett wants to talk about that.
Well, I think the answer is both. I think they go hand in glove. What I have heard, is we don't want the 130,000 hectare fire like we're seeing down in some of that lakes and Maurice area. So the idea is to create that heterogeneous forest at the landscape level that gives us a much better chance. So you have different age species, different species, it's all broken up. So when you do get that large fire, you have more opportunity. You're not gonna get it on those high-end burn days. But if it's burning into another fuel type or another forest condition, and your overall polygon size is smaller, you may have opportunity to go into those areas that are not burning as hot. And whether you're using natural or personally created features, you may have a better chance to suppress it. Right, so I think that is the same at the landscape level. If you break that up, that fire that comes from the landscape into the community is gonna have a much harder job to do that. As far as the community goes, that's where you get more intensive and more aggressive around there, because that's what you have that's more of the static. That's a community that isn't moving. So you want to do more in and around that community at the same time. Without fire starting that community, you're wasting a lot of your time. So out in the forest where things are moving and there's not as many fixed values and they move spatially over time, you have to maintain that heterogeneity to the landscape. But that's the idea, is through suppression, forest, landscape, climate, all these things, we have allowed much larger areas of continual homogeneous forest to be out there. And we've seen the results of that, especially post mountain climbing, really having huge amounts of horizontal continuity, which is another thing from a fuel management, that if we break up that continuity, either through like I say, different species, different age classes, but at the same time incorporate and use human created natural barriers, we have a better chance. When it's really hot, dry, and windy, and we're at that, most of it burns, and that's life, right? So what this does is gives us a better chance, but we also, yes, have to be realistic that on some cases, we aren't gonna win. We see with the pine beetle, we have 5-6 consecutive days in a row of fire weather that allows that thing to be a monster. Whereas in a green lodgepole pine forest, we might only have 1 day in a row, and that would allow us on that second day to get in and do something. You also can't do your response measures overnight like you typically could in a green stand, because there's so much down, it still burns so hot, and there's many hazards with it. So it's a whole bunch of things.
It's a package, like there's no just one answer. So that's what the modified response is, and having different zones and PCLs and pods, these kinds of things. The director of innovations is definitely thinking about it. He's definitely thinking about it. I don't know anybody in Wildfire thinking about it, because the scale is so small, super small, and also some people that are doing drone seeds are thinking about coating the seeds with biochar. But it's another use. Like, how do we? One of the ways we can either burn stuff to get rid of it, or we can take those chips to the pellet plant, or we can create biochar, or some people Pat Brochet was telling me for BCTS in the ITSLs over there, like the innovative, what is it? ITSL stand for Innovative Timber Sale License. They're taking the whole tree over to the pellet plant, branches, everything. So there's other ways of dealing with the disposal of debris from thinning. but we're struggling to find a market or make that economical or scale it up so far.
And biochar, there is actually an innovative clean energy fund for BC is sponsoring some people out of Squamish to demonstrate biochar. It's mostly around how they can switch it from emission to the zinc, and it's usually linked to carbon funding. So they're trying to use it basically as a source of carbon markets. So there is, and the province is supporting some of that. It's not directly related to our project, except the degree to which it's sort of someone can enhance or incentivize more economic fuel reduction treatments.
Yeah, I just wanna, you talked about various people being involved, and I think the farmers in the valley and the loggers and all those people could get together to draw landscape fuel breaks that were significant and put them together and have access that you can get in there and fight the fire and all those kind of things that are perfect.
Or have them involved somewhere.
Somebody bring them all together. That's not the easy part, but.
No. Yeah, but anyway, it's multi-stakeholder, like you say. And so we need to run ideas by, and it's got to be led by technically competent people. And not to say that the farmers aren't, but because they've got their own sort of way to view things and make meaning of what they've seen in the landscape over a long period of time, possibly. So yeah, there's some important information there. Multi-stakeholder is the word that we got to keep in mind.
How would you recommend that riparian corridors or biodiversity corridors be treated if they're in danger of acting as fire wicks?
That's not a question for me. That's a question for a decision maker about about relative values. But I believe that there's ways we can meet both sets of objectives.
We have done it in this area. We worked with ecologists, and obviously the decision maker has to be okay with it in this process and have the amendments and all the things. But you can often meet multiple objectives in areas like Mildew Ridge Range or riparian reserves, etc.
The one thing you have to be careful about is if you're harvesting on either side and you're only providing a 30-meter wide buffer, that's going to be dried out.
Yeah.
A lot more significantly than have that entire forest been intact, just because the wind, the sun, the whole penetration. And that's not going to give you much of a barrier with any kind of fire if it's slashed on either side. So this all comes down to, it depends, and things are very site specific, but those are
Site specific and objective specific. So it depends what your objective is it a fisheries objective, wildlife biodiversity objective?
So conservation components are part of the Baltimore Marine Wildfire Resilience Project, so we'll be weaving those into the story.
See, whole tree harvesting has been studied in a few cases, but at the forest landscape planning level, have you looked at those for licensees rather than block processing? Any sense?
I think I know where they're going with that, and that's the kind of thing that has to come out of forest landscape level plans.
Yeah.
And you know, it's a consideration. So whoever that is thinking outside the box, trying to come up with some ideas. So that's good.